Well, with this all back together, cleaned and lubricated with graphite powder, I'm just going to unhook this spring that I had so much trouble hooking up, swing this arm out into the blade's open position and start putting my shutter blades back in place. Now the shutter blades, I've cleaned these all carefully. I haven't polished them. There are marks on the end of this blade, they're scuff marks, they're not going to go away. This is our blade number 1. And blade number 1, there's 3, there's 2, this is 1 over here. Went here. And I've got its screw here. Now it's awkward getting these shoulder screws down correctly. The blades tend to get trapped under the shoulder instead of going around it, so you often have to muck around with them a bit to get them seated correctly. That's good now. You can tighten that up. As the blade actuating ring moved, you'd see that would swing the blade in. Blade number 2. Blade number 2 goes here. I'm looking at these little tiny scratches I made to identify my positions. And I think these screws were all the same length, so it probably wouldn't have made much difference which one I put where, but I've got these screws all organised according to where they came from. That one's seated round the blade very easily. And blade number 3. That screw went in very easily. That's fairly unusual. Okay, so there's our blades all back in place. Now if I swing my blade actuating ring back in place by swinging that arm in, those blades are now tucked up neatly out of the way. You can see they're closed in the middle there quite well. That's ready. That shutter is ready to have the shutter case put back over the top and be secured. So if I take my case, I've got to work out which way up this goes. The holes are not symmetrical, but they're not 100 miles away. Might be easy to do it this way up today. The blades can't fall off here, unlike ones we're normally dealing with. So that goes there because that is where that cable release thing goes. So they're all lined up. There's my 3 holes there, so I can put the case screws in place. With these 3 blade shutters, the blades are held in place with screws individually. They're not just held in place with the case, so yes, you can do clever things like put the mechanism plate in the case. Normally you would be fitting the case over the mechanism plate because the blades are sitting loosely on their pivots. Check that make sure there's no problem with the blades. No, they open and close nicely. do up the 3 case screws. So we have our diaphragm here, it all adjusts nice and smoothly there, and our shutter blades here are nice and snappy in their action. And that means that the next thing to do here, when the video camera catches up, is it thinking about focusing today? Yes, thank you. The next thing to do will be clean the other components and start putting them back onto the mechanism plate. So to the assembly. We can start with the B lever, which sits here. It's got a return spring here which we've got to get positioned. That makes it awkward to get its little bush and screw in place and get this all lined up. The bush sits on top of the lever. The screw goes through the bush and into the mechanism plate itself. That went very smoothly. Now I'll see if I can get the tail of that spring hooked behind this lever. Yes, that went. And snug that screw up. Don't over tighten screws in a position like that. You'll find that they may bite into the mechanism plate and effectively tighten up on the lever, and then nothing will work correctly. Right, so if we move this thing here, we'll be able to, that lever should just about fall into place, does it? I can't see any sign of it falling into place. Is that centered correctly here? Appears to be. That's better. It appeared that this bush was slightly loose on the screw and was effectively moved, the pivot point had effectively moved too far this way, so this piece didn't drop into place. That's a trap for young players. That's obviously, this piece does look a slightly bent. I suspect that it's just not as square as it should be. That's okay. Whatever the cause, it's working nicely now. The shutter release lever can go on. Here we have it. And I'm just going to run some molybdenum paste through the pivot, through both of these notches, and on the tips of these levers here. That's the B and T. That works this B and T settings here. Getting this thing over the post is always awkward. Alright, that's over the post. That's sitting in position. And as this swings through, you'll see that it picks up this lever, opening it, and on the second stroke, this lever drops behind this post and that lifts the lever out of contact. So that's our T action. Of course there's no return spring action on this because that's the next piece to go in. This is the 500th of a second speed spring. That goes, no, a 300th of a second speed spring in our case. That goes there. And the return spring for the shutter release is here. This is also the extension on this, couples to where the cable release socket will be over here. So that's sitting in there. I've got to get this end of it in line with that shutter release lever. Get the spring tucked down into the case, which is sometimes awkward. It is today. It just doesn't want to drop in. There's a groove in the case that spring sits in when it's pushed down correctly. It's in there now. Why is that not dropped in there? It's better. There's our BT action. That's good. Now the cable release socket, or where the plunger would go on this shutter on this particular camera, if it had a plunger, which it doesn't because it's missing, this goes here, and as the screw drops in from here, you can only get to the screw when you're holding the shutter release button down, which swings this arm down out of the way, uncovering that screw hole. There you go. There's that part. The latch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. See if we can get that placed. Is that where we want to be? I think we want to be up here. That looks more like it. Get that screw in there. The post for this component goes into a hole which is right on the edge of a machined surface here, so sometimes it doesn't want to go in a straight line. That looks good. So now we want the main lever. Before I put that in there, I'm just going to put some molybdenum paste on a couple of surfaces in the shutter body itself. Here and here. Here. And on the arm, on the retard gear train, there. And some on the tip of that catch won't hurt. That'll do. The main lever, run some around the inside surface where it runs around the lens tube, around the outside surface, on the bird pawl, some at the head end, some on that face of the tail. Check everything appeared to get something. It did. We can get this in position. Slide that spring into there. Drop that over the lens tube. Hold back that, swing the arm back, allow that to drop down, swing that out, allow that to drop down. It appears to be good. Get its return spring hooked over the post. This is the main spring for the shutter. Needs to be hooked over this post. That all looks appropriate. So the speed settings cam plate. Molybdenum paste around the inside. That's where it runs around that lens tube. If that's not smooth, it'll feel unduly stiff when you're changing the shutter speeds. On these surfaces here, where it contacts the arm on the delay action, the retard gear train, and where the spring is compressed to give us our high speeds, fastest shutter speed, there's a little groove just in there by the T and the B sign. And that's about it. This should go on there now with little or no argument. Yep, just making sure that the B lever was not trapped underneath. Right, so that's our T setting. This is our B setting. This would be 1 second. The fastest speed is where this spring's compressed. This is our 300th of a second speed. That's pretty snappy. Our 10th of a second speed should be somewhere around about here. I would have said that was a bit quick, but we'll find out when I test this. I might have to make some adjustments. If the shutter speeds are unexpectedly fast after you've serviced the shutter, it's usually a sign that someone had adjusted the speeds on a dirty shutter. That instead of servicing the shutter that needed servicing, they simply mucked around with the speed settings to try and get a better response. Now, that sort of behaviour is not very common, but it does happen. It's a mug's game. If the speeds aren't right, the first thing you need to do is service the shutter, and then when you've got a freshly serviced shutter, you can think about making adjustments. Never make adjustments to a dirty shutter. I think that's slightly fast. I'm pretty confident of that. However, everything else looks good. So I'll go away and test my speeds. I'll come back and make adjustments if I need to. I hate adjusting these speeds in these shutters. It's awkward, and you don't want to be doing it if you don't have to. Now, one of the features of these shutters is that you've got this post sticking out. That's where the plunger would fit. In this case, it's sticking nice and high, and it stops the action of this pointer going past the f3.5 mark, because of course you've only got an f3.5 lens. If that wasn't there, you'd be able to move this fully open to about the f2 mark, but of course it would make no difference with your f3.5 lens. In some cases the height of this is quite low, and this will actually draw back over it. I mean, this has got quite a pronounced taper over the top of it. That can lift over the top and cause you problems. And I have such a shutter, which I'll show you later, that had exactly that problem. That this piece was a little bit low, and this arm would travel over it. All you have to do is move your shutter, your aperture settings button at the bottom here, a little bit robustly. It popped straight over the top of this, rolled up that slope, and to make it worse, the tip of this lever's got a slope on it too. So it just rolled up that slope and clipped behind the other side there. So basically you couldn't shut the aperture back down. You could, and the answer was simple. But anyway, speed testing. Well, I've just cleaned the lenses, front and rear, with some domestic glass cleaner. They can be screwed back in place. The shutter tested up. The slowest speeds were very slightly faster than normal, certainly within probably 10% of the stated speed, which is well within specification. The fastest speed was interesting. The 300th of a second probably produced something very close to a 200th of a second. The 100th of a second speed was probably very close to its rated labelled speed. So that was interesting. So the top speeds of shutters typically was somewhat optimistic. That's probably the nicest way to put it. And this shutter can go back on the camera body, so I'm just going to wipe this inner helical here, the front surface of that inner helical, with a bit of naphtha to remove any grease that's on it. And likewise the rear shutter case, although that's very clean. And I did that because you end up with grief otherwise. There's nothing but friction locates this shutter. It holds it firmly, it stops it rotating. And if you've got a little bit of good lubricant at the back there, you will have no friction to speak of. You'll do that retaining ring up as tight as you like, but it won't stop the shutter rotating on the body. There was never a locating pin on those shutters to locate them. See if I can get my retaining ring started on here. Now, finally, now the Kodak sign should point towards the end of the camera, but your position, your correct position for the shutter is seen here. Make sure that the focus knob is all the way around at the end of the travel at the infinity position, and then you can line up your infinity mark here on the shutter, that line with the infinity mark on your focus scale ring, and that's where it needs to be. There's a second scale over here, the same. So that's where it needs to be. Getting it to sit there, stay there and be tight there is a different matter. Let's have a look. I've only got this finger tight at the moment. It's almost certainly not correctly aligned, or it's not far off. I'd be happy with that if I could get it to stay there. So I'll put my lens spanner on there and see if I can tighten this thing up without the shutter moving on the body. Check what I've achieved. That still looks good. You have to remember you're putting a fair bit of rotational force on that shutter when you cock the shutter, and particularly when you cock the shutter when it's set to the 300th of a second speed. That's good, that's aligned correctly. So that means that this camera is finished. And apart from a quick wipe over, this one's ready to go home to its owner. Everything's working nice and smoothly, and of course we don't have all that rust inside the door anymore. So there we have it. That's a nice Kodak Retina, the type 117, the first of the Retina models, and that was followed with a long series of models right through to the 60s. Oh, I meant to tell you more about that shutter problem with the aperture pointer. I better go and see about that. This is a type 118 Retina, and its potential problem here is if I rack that focus right out to bring this pointer to the front, if you move the aperture pointer around here, you'll see it hits that block where the cable release would fit. If you give it a bit of an extra push, it rides up that slope and traps on the other side. If you had one like that where that had happened, what would be the answer? Well, the answer would be move the focus out so that the lens is as far forward as possible. Bring your aperture pointer up against that stop, because it'll be trapped over here, of course, on this side. Just put something under there and just lift it slightly and move it across so that it's on the other side. It's not something that problem you couldn't have normally when the camera was in the condition that it would have been when the camera was new, because you would have had a shutter release plunger here which would have prevented you from being able to move your aperture pointer back across the top of that thing under any conditions. And when the focus is returned to the infinity position, it's harder for that pointer to jump over because it's trapped by the focus scale ring. That stops it pushing out to lift over the top of that boss. But yes, you couldn't lose that if you had your plunger present. Of course, the plungers are not present on this particular camera, and that's what caused the problem. Never mind, all dealt with now. That's back, and these ones can go home to their owner. One of each, 117, 118.